Arizal HaKadosh, the great Rav Isaac Luria, the 16th century scholar and Kabbalist, was known to have a certain Ruach HaKodesh, a divine insight or inspiration, almost like a form of prophecy. The story is told, he once went over to somebody in his base medrash and he says, Mashiach is here! Come with me to greet him! And the man's eyes opened wide, excitedly jumped up. He said, I'm coming, let me just grab my coat. And the Arizal said, sadly, now it's too late. We missed him. If you have to grab your coat first, then you're not really ready. There's a Rashi at the end of Parshas Vayeshev. It has really always bothered me and baffled me. I've seen the question asked and I've seen answers suggested, but I'm always left wondering. And I'd like to share with you an insight, something I thought of new this year that I think helps explain the story a little bit. Let's remember what we're up to. At the end of Parshas Vayeshev, Yosef finds himself still in jail. He had been put there unjustly. He was framed by Eshes Potiphar. Poor young Jewish guy who finds himself in jail, and he meets two other people, the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ofim, the butler and the baker. We know the story. Each of them have dreams. Yosef successfully interprets them. He tells the baker that he will be put to death, and the butler that he'll be returned to his post. He will once again be the royal butler. And in his interpretation of the butler's dream, he asks him, he beseeches him, please, remember me. When you're working for Paro again, don't forget me. I'm stuck here in jail. Ask him if he can remove me. It's like the end of a presidential term. We're experiencing that right now. And people are submitting their pleas and their beggings for pardons. It's the last chance, at least for this president, to pardon people. That's what Yosef probably felt like. It's my last chance to speak to someone who has the ear of Paro. Don't forget me. And sadly, tragically, the Parsha ends by telling us, V'lo zachar sar mashkim es Paro es Yosef vayishkachehu. And the butler doesn't remember Yosef, and he forgot him. Then Parshas Mikeitz begins and tells Vayihi Mikeitz shnasayim yamim, and it was after 2 full years that Yosef was stuck in jail. Now, think about that for a moment. We read through it quickly, but again, a poor young Jew all alone who's been put in jail unfairly, stuck there for 2 years, probably in terrible conditions. What did Yosef do to deserve this? So harsh, so severe. And Rashi cites the Midrash that tells us. Rashi writes at the end of Parshas Vayeshev, Mipnei shetala bo Yosef lizochro. Since Yosef pinned his hopes on the butler remembering him, meaning as opposed to having faith and emunah in Hashem, Huzkak lios asur shtei shanim. He was forced, he deserved, to end up staying in jail for 2 full years. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, and Rashi quotes from Tehillim chapter 40, Ashrei hagever asher sam Hashem bivtacho v'lo fana el rehavim. Praiseworthy is the person who places his trust and his faith, his bitachon in Hashem, and doesn't turn towards selfish or arrogant human beings. Yosef is being criticized by Rashi, by the Midrash, for putting his hopes in a human being, in the butler who very quickly forgot about him altogether, rather than maintaining his emunah and his trust in Hashem. And I wonder, what did Yosef really do wrong? I mean, firstly, where do we see any indication that Yosef stopped believing in Hashem? He seems to actually do something pretty logical and reasonable. There's a man who knows him, who probably owes him a favor for interpreting his dream, who works for Paro and has the ear of the king. Yosef would have to be a fool not to ask him for a good word, not to ask him to remember him and to mention him to Paro. Are we supposed to just depend on miracles and assume Hashem will take care of everything? Aren't we expected to put in our own effort, our hishtadlus? Should we stop all activism and advocacy for ourselves, for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel? Where do we see some indication of Yosef misdirecting or misplacing his faith? Plus, ironically, who is it that actually does remember Yosef in the end? It's the Sarah Mashkim. When, in Parshas Mikeitz, Paro has his dreams and can't find someone to correctly, satisfyingly interpret them, it is the Sarah Mashkim who says, oh yeah, I remember there was this guy in jail who beautifully interpreted our dreams there. Maybe try him. And Paro listens to him. And that is how Yosef gets out. What did Yosef really do wrong? Let's take a closer look at the Psukim when the Torah describes how Yosef was finally taken out of jail. Parshas Mikeitz, Perek Mem Aleph Pasuk Yud Dalet. Vayishlach Paro Vayikra El Yosef. Paro sends somebody and calls for Yosef. Vayiritzuhu min habor. They quickly take him out of the pit, out of jail. Vayigalach. Vayichalef simlosav. And he shaves and he changes his clothing. Vayavo El Paro. And he comes before Paro. Also a little bit strange. Why is it telling us that Yosef shaved and changed his clothing? Is that important to the story? Rashi says that it's mipnei kavod malchus. The reason that he shaved and changed his clothes is because is out of respect or honor for the king. Okay, makes sense. But why is that something that we need to know? I mean, in Sefer Shmos, Moshe and Aaron go and speak to Paro all the time. Presumably before they went to speak to him, I'm sure they also put on nice new fresh clothing, trimmed, groomed themselves. Mipnei kavod malchus, out of the honor of Paro, they also went looking their best. And yet the Torah doesn't go out of its way to say each time Moshe shaved, put on clothing, and then went and spoke to Paro. It just says he went to Paro. We can assume that he went in proper attire. I mean, Yosef here was coming from jail, so he was probably in not in great clothes. So maybe, but is that what would have been missing if the Torah had skipped that? Why is it important? Why is it essential to mention Vayigalach, Vayichalef sim losav, and he shaved and he changed his clothing? But I want to, before we get to that, focus on one specific word in this pasuk, and it's the word Vayiritzuhu, translated as "and they quickly took Yosef out of the pit." Vayiritzu is from like the Hebrew word ratz or larut, which literally means to run. And in the Artsro Chumash, it translates that as, and they rushed him from the dungeon. There's certainly an implication of speed, things happening very quickly here. Which I guess makes sense. Paro was probably anxious and uptight. He wants someone to interpret his dreams, and if he hears that the right person might be there, he probably said, go get him quickly. Paro wasn't known to be the most patient person, so this whole process happened very quickly. But the Sforno says there's something much deeper going on in this pasuk. Before I read the words of the Sforno, the Ramban says a number of times in Sefer Bereshis, he doesn't mention it here explicitly, the Ramban teaches us about the idea of Ma'aseh Avos Siman Labanim, that which happens to our patriarchs, our ancestors, specifically to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, is a siman, is a sign, foretells what will happen to their descendants, to us, to the future of the Jewish people. History repeats itself. And I think this, according to the way the Sforno is going to explain, is a perfect example of that. The Sforno writes, Vayiritzuhu min habor, kederech kol tshuas Hashem, kena'ases kemo rega. That Yosef's redemption from the pit, Yosef's being freed from the pit, was done in the way that all teshuas Hashem, that all redemptions affected by Hashem occur, which is that they happen very quickly. And suddenly, perhaps even when you least expect it. Yosef was just sitting there one day. He had no idea what was going on outside of jail. He had no idea probably that Paro had dreams and that his name was being mentioned. And all of a sudden, quickly, someone comes around and says, get up, let's go. We're going to Paro. You're out of jail. Let's go, get dressed, shave. And that's what all teshuas Hashem, the Torah teaches us, are like. When Hashem brings redemption, whether it's to a person or to a people or to our nation, it often happens, kemo rega, pitom, very quickly and suddenly. Kach haya inyan Mitzrayim. Kamro ki gorshu mi Mitzrayim, kamram zal shelo hispik b'tzekam shalavosenu lahachmitz. That's what it was like when we left Egypt. That's why we had matzah, not bread. Even though there we sort of knew where it was heading. I mean, we had the 10 plagues, so we understood maybe redemption was on the horizon, but still when it came so quickly and so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that we didn't even have time to wait an extra couple minutes to let our bread rise. We just grabbed our matzah and ran. Porno quotes a couple of other psukim from Tanakh at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of Malachi. The pasuk says, "Upisom yavo el heichalo ha'adon asher atem mevakshim." That when that master, that person, Mashiach, comes, that person who you seek and you request and you daven for, he's going to come pitom, suddenly, out of nowhere. We say in Shir Amalos, chapter in Tehillim, but we sing it at our Shabbos meals before benching. When we sing and we daven for the future redemption, for the Geula, we refer to it as Ka'afikim B'Negev, like a flash flood in the desert. You're walking in the desert, it's dry, there's not a drop of water to be found, and if a flash flood comes so suddenly, so unexpectedly, but so strongly, so intensely, it can be scary, it can be dangerous. That's what the Geula is going to be like, when we're going to least expect it, and it feels like we're in the midbar, in the desert, in Gullus, we're exiled, and all of a sudden, suddenly out of nowhere, the Geula is going to come so powerfully, and so intensely. If there's one person who I could think of that epitomized this understanding, this absolute steadfast belief that the Geula is going to come so quickly and we better be ready for it at any moment, it was the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim, who died 90 years ago. The story is told that he had a bag packed at all times. He had a little suitcase with some clothing that was always packed and ready. When Mashiach comes, I don't have to start packing. I don't have to grab my coat. I'll just take my wheelie that's already ready and run off to Eretz Yisrael. I read a few months ago, I was reading an article where it quoted from, I believe it was a student of his son-in-law, somebody who had some tradition or contact with his family who would know these kinds of things. And the writer asked this person if that story was true. And he said, I really don't think so, because from what I know, the Chafetz Chaim didn't have any extra clothing. You don't even know how little he had. An extra pair of clothing to sit in a bag unused, he had nothing extra. He had no excess. But what certainly is true, and we know from many people who heard it directly from him, that he certainly emphasized the significance and the importance of the study of the laws of Kachim and Karbanos, sanctity and sacrifices, things that directly took place in the Beis HaMikdash, that he was steeped in the study of the laws of the Kohanim. He himself was a Kohen, and that he was constantly preparing so that when Mashiach would come, the Beis HaMikdash would be rebuilt, he would be ready to jump into the Avoda and to work in the Beis HaMikdash immediately on the spot. And he encouraged others also. We have to learn about the laws of the Beis HaMikdash. The parts that sometimes when we get up to in the Parsha, we skip over because it seems irrelevant or ancient or archaic. For the Chafetz Chaim, that was relevant because it could happen at any moment, because the Geula is going to come terrifying, like the blink of an eye, Kafig and Bנגב, like a flash flood in the desert. It might sound extreme. Live a life where you expect that at any moment the Geula is going to come. But the truth is, it's a mindset. I was recently reading an article that was written by somebody who was a firm person. I know he didn't. I don't mean to be critical, because I understand when you're talking about current events or politics, it has its own way of being discussed. But he wrote something. He was writing about the challenges and the complications of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and relationship. He wrote that it's so deeply complicated, and there's so much that needs to be reworked and fixed, that there's really no reasonable way we can expect any sort of significant change in the next 100 years. Which I'm not here to comment on whether politically that is accurate or not. All I know is I read it, I said 100 years. Of course it will. I think in 100 years we're still going to be stuck in these problems. Mashiach is going to come. I don't know if it's going to be today, or tomorrow, or sometime very, very soon. But certainly in 100 years I don't think we're going to be stuck in this very same conflict. And you could write, I don't see any way out of this conflict other than when Mashiach comes it'll be fixed, because it's too deeply complicated and complex. I don't know how to solve it. Okay. But do we have it on our mindset? We consider it as a possibility, as on the horizon, is something we think about, something we want, something we consider. Do we really expect and believe that at any moment, maybe when we least expect it, perhaps specifically, Dafka, when we least expect it, that's when the Geula could come. Think about Bnegv, like Yosef being pulled out of jail. Rabbi Usher Brander, in his beautiful sefer, in his beautiful book on the Parsha, In-Depth Reflections on the Parsha Teachings, he explains maybe that's why the pasuk goes out of its way to say that Yosef shaved and changed his clothing. It happened so quickly, vayiritzu min habor, that he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't expecting it. If it hadn't been so quickly, then the fact that he shaved and changed his clothes wouldn't have been something so significant. But it was dafka because vayiritzu min habor. They took him out so quickly that that's what forced him to say, hold on a second, I have to shave, I have to change my clothes. But to me, it indicates something much more central. Because when I saw this, I started thinking maybe that's where Yosef went wrong. On his own level, Yosef HaTzadik, but he's being criticized by Rashi, by Chazal, the end of Parshat Vayishev, for putting all of his eggs in the basket of the butler, so to speak. For misplacing his trust and his faith, rather than in Hashem, but putting it in the hands of a human being. And maybe the fact that he had to shave and change his clothes when they finally did come to get him indicates that is what happened. Because, Yosef probably assumed, hey, listen, I gave my request to the butler, and he's going to mention it to Paro. These kinds of things take time. I'll hear about it. If he mentions to me to Paro, they're not going to come in right away and take me out. There's going to be a meeting. There's going to be a trial. There's going to be a discussion. I'll be on parole, whatever. It's going to be a whole thing. I'll hear some whisperings. Things happen slowly. They take time. You don't get pardoned. You don't submit your request for a pardon and it happens the next day. This kinds of thing takes months, weeks, months, years. But what Yosef forgot is that Teshuas Hashem, the redemption from Hashem, happens pitom, when you least expect it, right away. If Yosef still had maintained his full emunah in Hashem, then how could he have been sitting there unshaved, unkempt, in dirty clothes? Of course, sometimes your clothes get dirty. You can't be in clean clothes every single second of the day, and he was in jail after all. But I think the indication the Chumash is trying to portray, the idea that the Chumash is trying to teach us, is that Yosef wasn't ready. He had lost his faith in Hashem. And again, on his own level, Yosef HaTzadik had lost his faith in Hashem. He's put his trust in the Sarah Mashkim. And the fact that he had to shave and change his clothes shows that he wasn't ready. He wasn't expecting. He wasn't prepared for the Yeshuas Hashem Keherafayim, the redemption from Hashem that happens in the blink of an eye. The Chafetz Chaim, who was told, and I'll conclude with this, used to quote the pasuk from Koheles, chapter 9, verse 8. At all times your clothing should be white. Many of the Mefarshim understand this to mean that we should remain free from sin. We should live in cleanliness and purity with white clothing. The Chafetz Chaim says what it means is you should always be in your best clothes, ready, waiting, clean, prepared for Mashiach to come. Don't be caught in dirty clothes. Don't be stuck saying, I have to run, I have to shave, I have to change my clothes. I have to get my coat. We have to live our lives, and we have to be active. We have to be activists, and we have to advocate for ourselves. We have to put in our ishtadlus. We have to speak to the butler. We have to be involved politically and actively in every way that we can. But equally, more importantly, is that we maintain our emunah in Hashem and are always ready and are always expecting and are always living with the belief and the trust that the Geula can and will come very quickly, suddenly, when we least expect it. Let's make sure that we're ready. Have a great week.